Greetings, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Zoe, and it is a pleasure to be here today at the International Congress of Behavioural and Social Science Research. It's actually my third year in a row presenting, and I was excited to talk to you about my topic today. But before we get there, just a bit of context about me. I am an accredited clinical social worker, Australian, and I've spent the last 10 years living outside of Australia, 5 years in Southeast Asia. The last 4 years have been in Mauritius. I wear many hats, but I work clinically as well as working with organisations right across the globe. This is important for the topic because I'll be sharing with you a lot of experiences from my travels and asking you to reflect on yours. Because in this day and age, AI is very hard to avoid. So let's dig in. What we're going to be looking at is, first of all, what is that term AI slop? For some of you, you'll recognize it immediately. We're going to look at how our AI activity and the information that we are receiving affects us emotionally, relationally, and cognitively. We will then look at practical strategies to implement, and this is for clinicians, researchers, educators, and people who are working digitally, which basically means everyone. Hopefully, there will be something in this session for everyone. My opening question to set the scene is, how do you use AI? And personally, I started with research. I was using it to help me find research to underpin my own research, I guess. And I was also using it to find information, was basically the start of it. But now it's become almost daily. So there will be some type of activity, whether it is recording of my client notes, whether it is, yesterday I was looking at a recipe for healthy chickpea chocolate muffins. So most of us are finding that we have more and more reliance on AI to find information. Back in the day, it was, I'm going to Google it, and now we're going to ask AI. And some of you might be using this right across the board consistently at work and at home. It might have become that first point of call to access information. And I see this in discussions with organizations. There's been a lot of discussions globally about AI making individuals' work obsolete. There's fear around AI replacing us. But more closer to home, the conversations that I've been having with other clinicians is around how clients are using AI. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this session as well. So we're all a little different depending on what field you're in and how you're using AI. But one thing is for sure, it's here to stay. I do have a couple of friends that are, a little bit older than me who have said comments like, I don't use AI, I don't trust it. And I find that distrust is actually not just for people who are not using AI. Some of us also view the information from AI in a rather skeptical manner. Globally, let's look at some stats. So we can see here from 1 in 6 globally that are using AI, there was a sharp increase from the first half of last year to the second half. And this is what's meant by rapidly expanding. This little diagram here is from my last year in review from 2025. Some of you might have done this with ChatGPT, and I use AI to write my blurbs or blog posts that go alongside my Instagram videos. And so my award from Chat was most likely to turn neuroscience into a punchline, because I'm constantly talking about neuroscience and the nervous system. So once again, your use of AI might be slightly different, but we're seeing it just embedded across culture. Some countries have been a little faster to utilize it, but what we're seeing is it's very normalized in the workplace. What I thought was interesting was the trust and the training lag. I have multiple clients that are in senior leadership, and some of them have commented on wanting to be more across this area. And others have said, but by the time I perhaps do a course in 3 months, that training will become obsolete because there's such a rapid expansion and movement in this field. But many of us, well, according to the stats, about half of us don't actually feel like we're using AI effectively. And I've considered that as well, because I've been self-learning along the way, where how good are my prompts for the information that I'm asking? I'm definitely better than when I first started, and I was getting all kinds of, to be perfectly frank, inaccurate research, which used to drive me insane. Fake references for the academics and the educators in this group. You might have had that experience where you're just looking at nonsense. And I would get really annoyed with this, but I'm much better with my prompts. So that's been learning. But if someone asks me, am I using AI effectively? I would probably hesitate. Yes, for all intensive purposes, but could I use it better? Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure my prompts could be better. So let's now look at the topic of today's session is AI slop. What does it mean? It's not just about incorrect references or information that is quite literally wrong. It's about a lot of what looks like well-constructed, well-written fluff. And there's lots of words, but you can read, I've read paragraphs of it, and I know I'm not alone here. When you just read multiple paragraphs and then think, you could have summarized that into 3 dot points. Why is there so much fluff here? And it can be not about, as it says here, it's not, this is AI versus a human perspective. It's more the quality of it, because it can look helpful, it can hide in plain sight, but it's often very weak information. And it's certainly context free. And we're going to dig into some of the fabulous research that's coming out in this area. But that term context free is one of the big criticisms of AI. Because we go to AI, we ask it a direct question, but it's not seeing the context of who we are, what our background is necessarily. I mean, the AI certainly learns based on your conversations with it, but it's only getting one very narrow window in terms of context. And the confidence in which it delivers the information is breathtaking. Because sometimes when you challenge it and then it will back down and say, oh, actually, no, that might have been, it doesn't use the term nonsense. I use the term nonsense, but it changes. And so what we're finding is that out there in the world, there are so many examples of AI slop. And I imagine for the educators and academics in the audience today, you will have come across a huge volume of this since the introduction of AI. Let's look at a really high profile example of this. So when the Maha report came out on making our children healthy again, it was, of course, spotlighted both in the media and also with researchers and academics because it seemed to be completely fabricated. A lot of the references were missing information, studies didn't exist, or they did exist, but that wasn't the outcome. And Kennedy and the Maha groups talked about how that it was backed by all these citations and it was so well informed when, as it turns out, it actually wasn't. And I think this highlights a really big risk in today's world, because are we stopping to look at where's the data? So in research, of course, the quality of our citations is incredibly important. And most of us have had that, I would argue, drilled into us. And I remember when I was first using the AI and asking for research, it would give me a blog post. And I'm thinking, I'm asking for research unless this blog post is from Harvard. And even if it is from Harvard, I still want to see the research that underpins the blog post. But that's also because of my training and my academic supervisors asking me, where is this source from? And having those discussions about the validity of the research. But because AI has sped up how much information we have access to very, very quickly and delivers it with this level of confidence, which is breathtaking, are we critiquing it along the way? And we can see, just based on this example alone, not as well as we should be. I was leaning into this with my comments here. We have access to information so much faster today. There's that level of confidence. And what happens is our help-seeking behavior often starts from what we used to Google. I know a lot of people who would Google health symptoms. And I know a lot of people come into therapy with ideas and concepts about what's wrong with them or perhaps their relationships. And I am absolutely not against people researching. In fact, as part of my clinical process, I'm always sending very reliable sources of information to clients by way of homework. I find that it's empowering. I don't have time in a session to do a psychoeducational group on a particular area that we're exploring, but it might be interesting for them to know. So out goes the resource after the session. So I think it's helpful, is my point here. But once again, what is that information? And then what happens when someone is self-diagnosing or has gotten to the end of the week and asks the AI a question as simple about a conflict that they might have had in the workplace? Now, the AI does not see context, does not understand the differences in personality types, the background, and it can answer without that knowledge. And even sometimes if it does have context, it's different from talking to a person. And what we see now is that more and more people are relying on AI to answer everything from health-related issues to mental health. There's been some very interesting pieces of research that have come out, and some of you will be aware of the more high-profile cases that have hit the media, where there was a young boy in the US where the AI was essentially supporting him to die by suicide, and now there's a litigation case around that. We saw that researchers posed as individuals with eating disorders, and the AI was giving advice on how to hide an eating disorder from family members. We also see that Stanford has found that it can reinforce stigma. We know that AI can be a bit of an echo chamber. What I put into AI comes back out at me because it essentially wants to tell you what you want to hear. Wants sounds like a very human way of framing that. But sometimes if I already have pre-existing ideas and stigma attached to mental health, for example, that might be mirrored back to me, therefore reinforcing the stigma. And we also see that if someone is struggling, the way in which they pose these questions, we don't have adequate guardrails in place. What we're also seeing is that not everyone has access to therapy in order to unpack their thought processes with a therapist. Depending on where you are in the world, therapy can be very expensive and inaccessible for a lot of people. Also, we're finding that children are using AI and they don't have essentially the understanding of empathy and what that looks like. Really interesting research from Brown University, where they looked at 15 different criteria for AI in terms of ethics, and they basically trained the chatbot in CBT. So cognitive behavioral therapy, for those of you that are not clinicians, and looked at what those responses were from users. And there was this almost, I'm going to call it fake empathy, where the AI would try things like, I hear you, or I see you, or I understand what you're going through. And that being on the receiving end, no, there's a very big difference between the AI saying, I see you, and being actually seen by another human, particularly a therapist, in in a CBT framework. And what we find as well from that Brown University research, the AI failed on all of these 15 different criterias around ethics. And one of their other critiques was around context. So when I am sitting in front of a client and they're telling me their story as they see it, I interpret that story, yes, based on the words that are coming out of their mouth, but also eye contact, body language, facial expressions, everything they don't say, their history, their background, their culture, all of these other areas that I learn from that person. So when they speak to me, the message, what is being said, makes up a small percentage of my understanding. And of course, the AI doesn't have that. There are three key areas that you can see on the slide here. We're going to talk about all three of these in a bit more detail. And I'd like you to reflect on your own experiences. When you're using AI, have you found yourself either mentally exhausted or found yourself emotional? So that could be high stress, your threat system has been activated, or perhaps you found yourself feeling confused. The relational is more about trust. We might start to distrust reliable sources because we've been bombarded with so much, it's my favorite word again for AI slop, nonsense, that we then don't see the validity of some sources. But then that trust can also come across to our relationships as well. And in terms of care, there can be friction. Let's look at these three in a bit more detail, starting with cognitive. When we have any kind of information overload, our cognitive abilities and our ability to reason and emotionally reason the content as well is limited. When we are across multiple pieces of work, we are switch tasking. We might be trying to find an answer, and we might be going down a rabbit hole of information. Some of you might have done this. I know I certainly have, when I've wanted to get across something, and I have found that I end up with more questions than I do answers. And sometimes that almost compulsion to search, this can create more cognitive load. And when we're rewording the searches and we're trying to find information, often we can find that we are searching for something that fits our existing narrative. So a cognitive bias of sorts. Let me give you some examples. All of these under other examples are things that I have encountered in therapy. A client comes into therapy and they already have some preconceived notions around what is happening. And once again, I don't mind it when people have gone off and done their research and have been learning about something. But what I also get very concerned about is when people have diagnosed themselves. And it's such a slippery slope. And I'll give you an example first of positive, and then we can move it into this. In my global sessions that I run on neurodiversity with Fortune 500s across the globe, I have asked the question to groups, how did you first learn that you were neurodiverse? And a lot of individuals have said to me and answered that question with TikTok. And the researcher in me is like, reliable source, but it's not all bad because they learn about it and then they go and get diagnosed, or they have become very good at masking and they have a late diagnosis because they've only been able to access information later on in life, and that spurred them forward into care options or being diagnosed correctly. But we also see that that might be a small percentage of the population, and other people are self-diagnosing based on information that they've received from the AI. Also, am I an empath and he's a narcissist? According to Facebook, that's just about half the world's population appears to be narcissistic. Now, narcissism, or the personality disorder, is maybe, I think the percentage is about 1% of the world's population. Now, that doesn't mean that someone doesn't have narcissistic tendencies or behaviors, but it just gets brandished around. It's a pet peeve of mine, because not everybody who does something that's self-absorbed is a narcissist. And we see that trauma is another word that's used to describe everything today. Another immense dislike of mine is that you're trauma talking, when in actual fact it might be that someone has just not learned particularly good conflict resolution skills. We seem to be very quick to be labeling everything trauma, and a lot of us do have trauma, so I don't want to minimize that. But what happens is that people can access incorrect information around this, be determined to diagnose oneself, and then be drowning in possibly inaccurate AI slop. And the AI will gravitate towards popular sources rather than sometimes the valid academic varieties. So pop psychology for the win, as opposed to something more significant to give people further insight. So this next slide here on emotional load, one of the questions that I ask my clients sometimes when they highlight social media as being problematic, they might be finding they are doom scrolling, or they are finding that they are looking at a certain type of content that causes them stress. Our emotional strain can be measured. So, for example, right before you are about to scroll, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 5? After you've spent 10 or 15 minutes either searching or scrolling, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 5? Sometimes we might find that we've gone from being relatively calm, so we've found information that confirms what we were looking for, but we continue to search and search. And the opposite can be occurring. We become more alarmed, so we reach for further reassurance. And this is one of the core reasons why we doom scroll in the first place, because we want to know in order to protect ourselves from something that is occurring. Let's look at some examples. We are living in times where there is a lot of war and crisis. And recently, I've found myself to be quite affected by this. I work with clients across the Middle East, and I've been keeping an eye on various news reporting channels, and I've found myself having various feelings about this, and it feels very close to home, even though I'm in Australia. So logistically, no, but it affects people that I care about in the region. And this can drive worry and anxiety. And I found myself wanting to check and keep up to date. Now, I'm not going to put my head in the sand and pretend that's not happening, because it matters. It absolutely matters. But I have been limiting some of this because I also know myself, and I know that that level of empathy that I might experience can lead to exhaustion. Other examples of this, people who are going through some kind of health crisis, they might find that they are searching for answers, checking and rechecking, any kind of late night doom scrolling. And sometimes parents can become panicked at symptoms of their children as well. So it might extend past the individual and into family members. And relational really speaks to how much of what's occurring with the AI is then being taken into real life. And I'd like to share some examples of this. Harvard University was looking at loneliness and AI usage. And what they've found is that when we perhaps brainstorm an email response or a conversation that we might have with a family member or a colleague, this can be helpful because we can work it through with the AI, and it takes us back to people rather than driving a wedge between you and your social connections. However, what Harvard University saw was that the more increase on AI, the more dependency on AI, the less someone did interact and engage with people. therefore making people more lonely and socially isolated. So with this, we might see that there's distrust. There can also be further assumptions made. So in my travels globally, I've heard many different concepts and notions of what therapy is. And certainly being a therapist, sometimes people have said things to me like, oh, why would I want to pay someone just to listen to me? You know, I have a dog or a cat. I can just talk to them. Like, did I just get compared to a cat? I mean, cats are awesome, but sometimes people think it's just I'm going to lie on the couch and talk about how I feel about my mother twice a week for 5 years. So there's some very interesting concepts of what therapy is and isn't. And once again, if we come to AI with a cognitive bias or a particular stigma, and it then mirrors back to us what it is that we believe in the first place, this is probably going to make us less likely to reach out. It can also cause further distrust. And what about the information that you are getting from the AI? I have found that when the AI response is like this, I find myself getting annoyed. I also find that because I work globally, I like global research, I like global examples, and that the AI tends to be very US centric, and that I often get examples that are American. And as you can see from my examples of everything from Maha to Harvard University, I don't mind American research. I think this is fine, but I also want to know what the rest of the world is doing. And I find that sometimes when I'm only getting one small window, I try to work on my prompts better. But I'm also finding that there might be a slight distrust, because as much as I've talked about humans and our cognitive bias, I also feel like the AI can be somewhat biased. And I have personalized my AI. Many of my clients have a nickname for their AI, and I do too. I call mine Chad, because Chad is an American therapist. Because that's what's being mirrored back to me because of the way in which I use it. And you can see there from that example that one, I'm personalizing my essentially relationship with a chatbot. And two, if I'm feeling that it's context thin or it's clinically weak, then how am I going to utilize this moving forward? So it not only might affect my work in certain ways, or I then tend to distrust, and I can do this as well, I distrust material that is clearly written by an AI. I had an email sent to me by a governing body of social workers recently, and it was very much written by AI. And I didn't even finish reading the rest of the article, because I read the first few lines and went, fluff. And so there's almost like a distrust when we might have seen this, because I like these emails normally because I find they're quite personable and relate to my field. So let's talk about what helps. Doing a review of your cognitive load and measuring that. So you might think, okay, this is the time frame that I'm going to allow. I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole, particularly if my emotional arousal has been activated, if I'm feeling more stressed, or if I feel like there's a sense of urgency, or I feel like I'm only getting one variety of content. Taking a step back and thinking about what are some of the guardrails that I can put in, and then protecting trust, looking at the reliable source. Really interesting research done on doom scrolling about this in particular. When we're looking at our social media feed and information is coming to us in short, sharp sound bites, we often don't pause and think, what is the validity of this source? Because by the time we've had that thought process, we're already on to the next piece of content. And so the brain actually is more likely to accept things as fact when it's just coming up in these short little sound bites, because that's not how we're designed to get information. And I've found that that's highly problematic of, I'm going to use Instagram as an example, because I can scroll through Instagram and people are preaching to me from what feels like a soapbox psychological theory that the AI has told them. And I can hear it sometimes in the language, classic AI expressions. You're not broken. That's another one that makes me go, ugh. So this is how I can tell. And what does that do for our trust, not only in other people, but in the information that we are receiving? Or is it having the reverse effect? We have this trust, and our accuracy, therefore, like Maha, has been affected. So let's say you've recognized cognitive overload, or you've been emotionally heightened, or you're beginning to feel very distrusting of the world around you. We can have a brief nervous system reset. And I'd like you all to do this from wherever you are in the world listening to this. Just look away from your screen for a moment and let your eyes rest on a point around you. Having a think about the posture where you are, and just trying to relax and drop your shoulders and unclench your jaw. Many of us find that we do carry a lot of tension in the upper part of our body. Deep inhale through the nose and an even longer exhale. When we deeply exhale, blowing all of the air out of our lungs, we find that we send a signal to the heart and to our nervous system just to turn down the volume of the activation. So while you're focusing on breathing and exhaling slightly longer than you're inhaling, think about what you can see in your room. Gently move your eyes around and look at 3 different items and name them in your mind. Once you've done this, come back to this session. But normally we can do this at any point throughout the course of the day, and it can be helpful to just think of what is the next useful action. So if we're working on something, slowing down that process, taking a pause, and then deciding on the next action. A slightly longer process, just by a couple of minutes, is to break it down. I would write this down or make a note of it. What starts the search or checking loop? Is there a particular trigger? Some of you might have identified doom scrolling tendencies or particular content that you see online that can be quite triggering. What kind of boundary and or guardrail can you set that's suitable for you? And then what do you do instead of one more search? You might like to get up, move the body. I'm all for just a 2-minute burst of energy, and also your social connections, speaking to a human. So much of our world is dominated by technology, and certainly with the introduction of AI, it's adding another layer, and it's another layer that brings us further away from our social connections. So reaching out to someone in your network as a way of breaking up your digital activities. So the key takeaways from this session: AI is a mental load issue. So it's not just about accurate data, it's about the volume of it and what we're looking at. That low quality content can erode these 3 areas: cognitive, emotional, and relational. When we map the information, when we're looking at the accuracy, when we're looking at our own response to this, we can set those small boundaries. As AI, as it says here down the bottom, can generate infinite answers, but we as humans still need usable ones. It's not about the volume, it's about the accuracy. And just finally, for those of you who would like to connect with me, you can see here I'm all over everything from the social media platforms. I've got lots of research articles on ResearchGate along with my website. You can just Google me, or the AI can certainly tell you where to find me. All right. So on that note, thank you all so much for attending and listening. And I hope you got something helpful and useful out of the session. And until next time I speak to you, bye for now. Take care.